Thank you, Madam President. I rise today because too many elected officials, too many pundits and editorial writers, too many elite economists, and too many leaders of big corporations have simply gotten too comfortable, too used to sending American jobs overseas. We've seen outsourcing time and again, from the United States Olympic Committee's decision to crown our nation's top athletes with a made-in-China beret, to leaders of American companies far too eager to cash in and shutter U.S. manufacturing plants and open doors to cheaper labor in foreign countries who don't just have a cheap labor advantage, also have weak environmental rules, non-existent or non-enforced labor laws, subsidies for currency, subsidies for energy, subsidies for land, subsidies for capital. In other words, in some sense, this whole Olympic debacle where American athletes, hundreds of American athletes at the opening ceremonies in London the United States Olympic Committee in some sense has simply said, we'll give the gold medal to China for cheating. In far too many cases, U.S. investors and executives have gotten richer at the largest companies, while U.S. workers in places like Hamilton and Youngstown and places like Lorain and Lima and Solon, Ohio, struggle to make ends meet. That's why, Madam President, I'm here with a simple message: let's replace outsourcing with insourcing. Let's see the Made in America label sewn into the blazers that members of Congress wear on football helmets worn by our student athletes. Madam President, I'm wearing a suit made by union labor in Cleveland, Ohio today, for instance. Let's see the letters USA stamped in every steel beam used in our country and the armored steel purchased by our U.S. Armed Forces. We must encourage companies to return to the United States, and we must discourage them from ever leaving. But right now, Madam President, we have it backwards. Our tax code is upside down. As it stands, businesses can classify moving personnel and company components to a foreign country as a business expense and therefore deduct the cost of offshoring from their taxes. So when a plant moves from Youngstown to Beijing, when a plant moves from Fremont to Xi'an, when a plant moves from Toledo to Wuhan, that company can deduct its taxes, deduct those moving expenses on its taxes and get a tax break for moving overseas. Combined with our outdated trade policy, with PNTR with China, with no real reporting requirements and even fewer, Madam President, even fewer enforcement rules and mechanisms, the current American tax law encourages companies to move jobs or offshore where labor is cheap and environmental and health standards are weak. We saw a decade of manufacturing job loss. From 2000 to 2010, we lost more than 5 million manufacturing jobs in our country. 1/3 of our manufacturing jobs disappeared from 2000 to 2010. Fortunately, in part because of the auto rescue, such a resounding success in Ohio, for instance, we have seen some 500,000 manufacturing job increase in these last 2 years. But we know what happens with manufacturing job loss. It can destroy a family which has a decent wage and then can't find a job with any kind of decent wage. It weakens communities. It undermines the tax base. It means police and firefighters and librarians and mental health counselors and teachers get laid off. But now the manufacturing sector is turning around. As I said, over the last 2 years, our country, led by the revitalization of the auto industry, is beginning to add manufacturing jobs. It's clear why our country and why my state of Ohio are good places to do business. We have a first-class workforce, a strong network of colleges and universities, manufacturing know-how that's second to none. Not only that, but companies returning to the U.S. because of higher costs associated with doing business abroad, whether that be transportation costs, higher wages in places like China, in the legal difficulties of doing business overseas. We're seeing some return, but it's unfortunately more anecdotal and not extensive enough that we obviously have to keep looking ahead and making more of it happen. That's the good news. In Ohio, we see more and more evidence that just demonstrates how companies are beginning to move operations back to the U.S. For instance, Apex Sports, based in Zanesville in eastern Ohio, produces softballs with an engineered foam core. Once made in China, Apex Sports now makes its softballs in the U.S. They got their start at the Muskingum Business Incubator, where I visited not too long ago. Roseweld Products is a small extruder in Columbus, now making its product in Ohio instead of in China. Columbus-based Priority Designs manufactures Desolve, a compostable netting bag system for yard waste. Its product is now made in the U.S., previously produced in Asia. We can do more to help Americans get back to work. It just makes plain sense to put U.S. tax dollars back into the U.S. economy. When U.S. tax dollars pay for something, like American flags that fly over our post offices, like clothing outfits at a federal agency, like any kinds of products bought by taxpayers, bought by the government. It makes sense. It makes sense on every level that those products be made in the U.S. Let me tell you about a 22-year-old family-owned company in Akron called American Made Bags. They're making bags for our Olympians and for the Army National Guard. They're making them here in America. Why shouldn't our national policies support American companies and support American workers? The Bring Jobs Home Act, sponsored by Senator Stabenow and many others with her, makes two common sense changes in our tax laws. It's a carrot and a stick approach. It gives a tax credit that any business can use against their overall tax liability for costs associated with moving a production line, a trade, or a business located outside the country back into the United States. The opposite of what we do now. In providing this tax credit, we give incentives to companies to reshore, bring back jobs that might have been moved abroad earlier to places like China or Mexico or India. 2006 alone, U.S. manufacturers claimed $45 billion in foreign tax credit, a huge financial advantage to companies that have sent jobs to China and Mexico and India. But instead of promoting job growth, U.S. tax policy rewards those companies for outsourcing. That's why we need to end the backwards practice that allows businesses to deduct from their taxes the cost of shipping jobs overseas. We need to turn our tax code right side up when it comes to U.S. jobs, promoting their creation, discouraging their elimination. That's what this bill does. It's about time. I close, Madam President, before yielding to Senator Heller. One of the things that happened out of the auto rescue that's a bit of an untold story. In Toledo, Ohio, at the Jeep plant, an assembly plant where the Wrangler and the Liberty are put together for purchase. Prior to the auto rescue, only 50% of the components at the Jeep plant, at the Chrysler Jeep plant in Toledo, Ohio, only 50% of those components were made in the U.S. Today, 75% of those components are made in the U.S. The glass comes out of Crestline, and the seats come out of Northwood, and much of the rest of the Jeep, of the Wrangler, comes from suppliers in Ohio and Michigan. Those are American jobs, a huge increase in American jobs when you consider 3/4 of those components are U.S. made, when only 3 years ago, half of those components. Those Jeeps are selling, as the Chevy Cruze is, made in Youngstown, Ohio. The components come from Ohio and Michigan and other states, manufacturing plants. It makes a huge difference in building a middle-class society. Madam President, I yield the floor.